Hi, I'm Sky McLeod. My thesis is called We're Here to Stay, Disability and Nonviolent Resistance. My advisor is Tom Hastings. Every good journey needs a map, and ours is the Movement Action Plan, developed by Bill Moyer. This is a tool used by activists to track the progress of a movement. A foundational concept of MAP is the idea that there are societal myths and societal secrets. Let's do a few examples. The American dream, societal myth. All people are treated equally under the law. Our country is safe because we have a military to protect us. Hard work, equality, and safety are shared cultural values or myths that power holders can use to sway people, but the truth is more sinister. Greed, inequality, and danger actually underlie these ideals. The myths are the outward facing narrative, and societal secrets are the hushed whispers of what actually happens. How does this relate to disability? Let's look at some American values. People should be able to marry the person they love. They shouldn't experience discrimination in employment because of an identity they hold, and freedom. All Americans deserve to be free. Now let's look underneath the hood. Marriage leads disabled people to lose access to health care, job discrimination is effectively legal, and people are still incarcerated for the crime of being disabled. These are just a few examples. There are sadly many more I could have chosen. The job of activists is to shine a light, bringing the secrets out and into the open. This is done through nonviolent resistance, such as protests, strikes, occupations, marches, street theater, the list goes on. The goal is to expose the secrets, to counteract the status quo dictated by those in power. This makes it seem easy, but the movement usually starts here. So, the first goal is simply to make people aware of the secrets. They don't need to agree yet, but they do need to be aware. The next step is to get people against the plans and actions of the power holders, and the final, probably hardest step, is posing a better world that people are willing to get behind. So, how does this happen? Well, in 8 stages. If we look at our 3 goals by percent of the population, this is the trajectory for people becoming aware of the problem, for growing opposition, and for support of the movement's solutions. So, we have the 3 goals, and the 8 stages all have names, but we'll get to that as we go. First step. Normal times. In this case, the 1930s, when the president was disabled, but you'd be hard-pressed to know that fact, since he went through a lot of effort to hide his disability from the public. It was assumed that if people knew the truth, that would be a wrap on his presidency. Enter the League of the Physically Handicapped, a bunch of 20-something New York Jews who noticed all the disabled veterans coming back from the war were getting New Deal jobs, but those who were born disabled or became disabled early in life weren't afforded the same treatment. They got up to a bunch of shenanigans, they had fun along the way, but their efforts were largely unsuccessful. They would have probably been forgotten if it wasn't for the historian Paul Longmore, who uncovered their story 60 years after it all happened. Normal times are over, and it's on to stage 2, called Prove the Failure of Existing Institutions. To do that, we have Judy Heumann. This is her in 2016, but in 1970, she wanted to be a teacher at a time when few teachers were wheelchair users like her. So to get her teacher's license, she needed to have a physical examination. When she went to her examination, she was asked to demonstrate how she used the bathroom, then told she couldn't teach because she was a fire hazard, effectively sending her hope for teaching up in flames. So she called upon the firefighters of constitutional rights violations, the ACLU, to help her fight the case in court and prove that what had happened was discrimination. But instead of representing her, they told her no discrimination had taken place. This situation with the ACLU is a great example of the existing institutions, such as the legal system, failing to protect humans from discrimination. Luckily for us, Judy Heumann was not one to give up, not just to get her teaching license, but ultimately to bring us through the remaining stages. So the third stage is called ripening conditions. Let's meet our next important person, Ed Roberts. In the 1960s, he attended UC Berkeley at a time when a disabled student going to college was literally newsworthy, affording him the charming headline, "Helpless Cripple Attends UC Classes Here in Wheelchair." He was housed in the teaching hospital on campus, but it became almost like a dorm as more disabled students followed in his footsteps. Berkeley at the time was a wild place where protest was everywhere, not usually for disability rights, but revolution was in the air. In the middle of all this, the independent living movement was born. How did it come to be? Well, of course, with a protest that led to more funds for the disabled students, allowing them to open a student center that offered peer-to-peer help with daily tasks of living so they could live more independently than ever before. It was such a successful program that it was spun off into a center for independent living off campus to serve the broader community. Ed Roberts was influential in making all this happen. Independence was the paper bag that accelerated the ripening of the disability movement, if you'll accept this forced metaphor. So the stage is set. Now we just need to put our tray tables in the upper upright position because it is time for takeoff. And what's the fuel for this takeoff? A really cool sentence. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. The TLDR of this sentence is that you can't discriminate against disabled people in any program receiving federal funding. This sentence was law in 1973 when Richard Nixon signed the act using the signature that I have recreated here with the utmost historical accuracy. But after the bill was signed into law, years went by and nothing changed. Why is this? Well, let's do a quick civics lesson. 504 is just a sentence. The real question is, how? How will this be enforced? The how comes from regulations that would be drafted by the Health, Education, and Welfare Department, or HUE. After HUE wrote regulations, other federal departments would write their own regs based off the HUE interpretation. Then, after all that, the people would finally get their rights. But HUE was stalling. Disabled people helped draft regulations. They continued to go unsigned. So the leverage point was at HUE, and luckily for activists, a new sheriff was in town. And by sheriff, I mean President, Jimmy Carter. On the campaign trail, Carter promised to sign the regs. Now he was president, and Joseph Califano was the new head of HUE. But Califano got in and was like, these 504 regs are too expensive. I need to rewrite these, and maybe this time with less disabled input. So a protest action was planned to take place at HUE offices in multiple cities across the U.S. Many of these demonstrations were short and sweet. They got the regional director to tell Califano to sign, then they left. One of the demonstrations, however, was an outlier. That was the one in San Francisco. Roberts had brought Human to California, and members of the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley kept the sit-in going, not just for one day. They occupied the building for 26 days, making it the longest occupation of a federal building in U.S. history. After those 26 days, they came out of the building victorious. High on this amazing victory, we can progress to the next stage, which is perception of failure. Wait a second. Is it victory or failure? Well, disabled people never fail. Just kidding. We fail all the time, but perception is fallible and Bill Moyer is not magic. The victory was not complete, though there was a problem on the horizon. Remember our civics lesson? The victory was great progress, but there was another step. Other departments would write their own regulations, which could be a problem if court cases weaken the HUE regulations, which is what happened with the Department of Transportation, or DOT. Luckily, in that struggle, a new activist group was to be formed. To start to get to know that group, let's meet this guy, Wade Blank. Blank was a reverend who marched with Martin Luther King on a dare. He helped students escape the draft and had a crisis while working at Kent State after 4 students were killed by the National Guard during a protest. Blank and his wife decided to move to the most boring place they could think of, Denver, Colorado, where Blank started working at a nursing home, running the youth wing and trying to give the young people in the home some of the same freedoms of people on the outside. Ultimately, this would prove too difficult as the nursing home was the site of much abuse. Instead, Blank helped the residents sue the nursing home and created a new community called Atlantis, which at its creation in the mid-70s was the second independent living center in the country after Berkeley. And similar to Berkeley, it would foster another activist force to be reckoned with, and one that is still going strong today, ADAPT, which stands for Americans Disabled for Accessible Public Transit. They will take us into the next era. So we can move to stage 6, majority public opinion. Back to the bus. ADAPT started to build chapters nationally that would go out and block buses, get arrested, and be back at it again. In the 80s, their numbers were growing. They became more audacious, and their power was undeniable. By the end of the decade, they were a major group, and it is in this progression that they started to win over the country, bringing them to the end of stage 6 and onto stage 7, which is success. And who embodies success like George H.W. Bush, the one we all remember? Or at least disabled people do, because this is him signing the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. A few months earlier was this iconic moment when an 8-year-old Jennifer Keelan got out of her wheelchair and climbed to the top of the Capitol steps alongside many other ADAPT protesters.
I'll take all night if I have to.
So what even is this ADA anyway? If you go off this photo I got from the internet, it appears to be 50% rights for blind people. Sadly, I'm a blind person, and I can assure you this infographic is mistaken. If you actually read the ADA, it is first and foremost a transportation bill, and it is in no way a coincidence that transportation was the main target of activism, because getting into the streets gets things done. Since I can't take all night with this presentation, even though doing the movement justice would probably mean I would have to, instead, let's take a minute to acknowledge how far we have come and move to the final stage, stage 8, called continuation, which, hey, is the name of the class we all are required to be in for our thesis. No relation. This stage is not an end, though. It is just a beginning. But since this is the end of my presentation, here's just a few photos of the last 30 years of activism. I hope you'll consider being part of the next 30 years of disability rights activism. Thank you.